Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 64th episode of our IWFM webinar series. As I said numerous times, I don't know where time's gone in terms of we're now on our 64th episode, but again, we're tackling a major topic for workplace and facilities managers up and down the country as well as globally. So today's episode is about agents of change, from net zero promises to genuine progress, with our partners Inenco, who supported our sustainability survey this year as well. So that's worth pointing out. So today's episode is really going to explore, to a degree, not necessarily COP26. We're going to kick off with that in a moment with the questions once I go to our esteemed panel, but ways to really explore to unlock the route to net zero, and really how the role of FMs can play to really support genuine change. So really today's episode is to get some insight from our panel today in their respective organisations, how they're tackling that change here and now, and possibly in 2022 and further. Yes, we're looking beyond the next year, but also how are we really going to meet those targets that of 2030 and 2050 respectively. So ideally, after today's episode, you're going to find in essence how you build a successful roadmap to unlock the net zero debate, and how we as an institute can produce guidance and support to really show genuine progress. So as I say, today's episode is supported by Inenco. So if we just move on, I've mentioned the panel and you can see them on your screens there. Their videos are beautifully HD quality. I'm Peter Brogan, Head of Research and Insight at IWFN, and many of you would have seen me on our previous episodes, and I'll be taking you through today's episode, which is live, which I'm probably proving how live it is right now, but we have got Q&As, and I will be encouraging you at certain points today to actually get involved in the discussions as we go along. So I am looking for you to really interact with our panel, but probably enough from me. I'm going to go across the panel as you see on your screens there. And first up is a gentleman I've known for many years respectively. He's part of our sustainability special interest group. I've got the right one there, Reid. I nearly stumbled. But Reid Cunningham, Strategic Development Director for BAM FM and BAM Energy. So Reid, if you could do a short introduction just to let know our viewers, listeners, who they'd be hearing from today. So Reid, over to you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Peter. Peter's already introduced me. I've been with BAM about 23 years. And for BAM FM and BAM Energy, my focus over several years now has been about energy efficiency, and more recently decarbonisation, and either carbon neutral or net zero projects.
Oh, thank you, Reid. And as I mentioned, a key volunteer across our community here at IWFM. So thank you for joining us today. So I've mentioned our partners, Inenco, and we've got a representative from Inenco today, and that's Beth Goodwin, Senior Account Manager and NHS Specialist. So Beth, good afternoon.
Afternoon, Peter. Yeah, it's an interesting one for me, this one. I don't usually get to do these kinds of webinars because I'm all in the public sector. So I've spent the last 3 years working with our NHS trusts here at Inenco on how they can procure green on their gas and electricity, and then working through their green plans and their heat decarbonisation plans. So yeah, really excited to get involved in the debate.
No, and welcome, Beth. Lucky to have you on by the sounds of it. So no, thank you for taking the hour out today to join us. Last but not least, we've got Stuart Wright, Operations Net Zero Delivery Director at Aviva. So same to you, Stuart. Good afternoon.
Hi, Peter. No, thank you for inviting me to join the webinar. So I'm Stuart Wright. I've been at Aviva about 20 years. I was in group property as group property director up until a few months ago. Aviva, as people may know, have announced ambition to be net zero as a company by 2040, and within that, to have all of their operations and supply chain carbon net zero by 2030. And my job is to deliver Aviva to be carbon net zero by 2030.
There you go, and you're going to probably share how you're going to do it to our audience today. So that's going to be interesting to find out more. So as promised, I think you've just heard, well, you certainly heard from our panel there. We've got an esteemed panel with a vast amount of experience across the subject area. So I'm going to remind people we do have a dedicated Q&A section in today's episode. So please bring in your questions, and I'll be asking you to join in on our very first question. So if we just move directly into the panel panel. We do have a host of questions to go through, but as I say, I will be taking audience questions as we go along. So I'm going to kick off. In my intro, I mentioned basically about COP26, and obviously today's episode is about net zero promises and how we actually make genuine progress as a profession, but also probably as a nation to a degree. So I'm going to kick off on that, and we're not dedicating the whole series or the webinar today to COP26, but I guess just to start off, and I appreciate not all of you were there or certainly seen some of the feedback about COP26 in the media and trade press, but if I started off with a question, what did you get excited about COP26? And I would also encourage our audience to start putting their views in, and I can feed that into the panel as well. So I don't know, I'm going to start off with ladies first because I was told I was a gentleman once, but Beth, what did you get excited about at COP26?
I think for me, the thing that got me excited initially was the idea that there was at least one model that suggested from the targets that had been set and the commitments that had been set, we might keep it below 2 degrees C. And that for me was a big progress point. Now, I know that people have maybe then dampened that a little bit because there are other models that suggest we won't under the targets that have been set. But I think that was a big point of sort of progress for me, that we finally have some targets that are starting to actually get us close to where we need to be.
No, thank you for that. And Reid, if I come to you next, what that word excited, I've put that in the question, but what got you excited, if anything?
Well, yeah, I think, speaking largely for myself, wasn't excited. I think COP26 failed maybe to secure an awful lot of excitement, but I think what it was a good stepping stone to the future. I think in itself, what we found was some important nations didn't really show up, and there was some watering down of commitments that were reported towards the end, particularly around, say, those nations that are using a lot of coal, watering down their commitments to reduce that. But I think it was there was genuine efforts efforts, but just the number of participants kind of leads to compromises. And I think on a roadmap there was progress, but nothing specifically to get very excited about.
Okay, thank you for that. And before I just go to Stuart, as I've promised to get all the panel on this question, I would encourage audience to put some of your views forward. So it'd be good to know from you that have kindly joined us, use the Q&A. What did you get excited about at COP26? Was Reid shared with us just politely there what didn't excite you? So from that point of view, we're looking for your views as we go along today's panel. So Stuart, last but not least again, and I won't be putting you last on every question, you'd be pleased to know. But in terms of what got you excited about COP26, or you were more in the camp of Reid?
I'm not sure. I think, I mean, one, I don't mind being last because it gives me time to think. I think it's raised awareness. I mean, people are now having more conversations about climate. I think people are beginning to join up the fact that major weather events has got some sort of link to carbon emissions, and so I think more sort of chat around the coffee machine, more conversations, which are I think becoming more informed. I think that sort of feels a bit more exciting. It's more on the agenda, and I think probably just getting 1.5 degrees as an aspiration, perhaps out there as the headline. Paris, I think COP21 seemed to be more of a 2-degree focus. I think although COP26 hasn't provided targets to get us to 1.5, it actually has got 1.5 on the agenda.
Okay, great. So going back to yourself, Reid, obviously COP26 in your humble view didn't hit the mark. So possibly looking forward rather than looking back, and I think this is the emphasis of today's episode. So we've kicked on COP26, but as promised, we're not going to put the whole focus on that. What should we try to achieve by the time COP27 kicks off?
Yeah, I think what will be really important is for individual governments to have a plan as to how they're going to achieve this 1.5 degree target that has been, but it's become kind of the target that COP26 was talking about. Right now, I think it's quite vague about that, but maybe by COP27, there'll be some more meat on those bones, and individual nations will have some plans about how they're going to contribute to that overall global target. I think the fact it's going to be in Egypt, I've seen some reports that could be quite interesting from the point of view of, say, public protest. I think Glasgow as a platform, allowed a certain degree of public protest and public frustration, maybe to be voiced. And Egypt might be a very different environment for that kind of thing, for the participation of the fringe. And I think what's interesting about it being in Africa will be probably overdue that a COP is held there, but issues to do with climate finance and adaptation and loss and damage associated with climate change might be sort of better received, in an African nation, whether or not Egypt in particular suffers from those things. That could be quite an interesting twist on having a COP in that location.
No, thank you, Reid. And Stuart, just coming to you, what's your aspirations, I hope, in terms of what we achieve by the time COP27 kicks off?
I suppose the COPs are important as perhaps milestones, checkpoints, etc. But I think we need to get to the point where we are doing things without having to be told and without having the targets. So I think it would be good to get to that point where a lot more private organisations, public organisations have actually set their own targets, so, started their own journeys, and that actually that more people are contributing to carbon emission reduction and reducing the global warming, because it's an area where I think we shouldn't need to be told to do. Certainly in Aviva, and I'm sort of saying, well, yeah, great, we've got some internal targets, but the internal targets are that they are bigger. They have a bigger purpose than just meeting a metric which we have set for our investors. They actually are, they're much more important than that. I think we need to get that into our thinking. This is much more important than just at checkpoints, at big conferences, seeing what's going on.
And Beth, last but not least on that point.
Yeah, well, I think Reid touched on one of the things that I think is really important, and that is the finance side. I think we really need to establish how we're going to go about providing funds to other nations that are more impacted by climate change than we are. I'd also really like to see biodiversity coming into this. We've got the biodiversity COP coming earlier next year, and I'd like to see some of those learnings being pulled in to COP27 as well. I think those would be some really good starting points. We also did a webinar with Mike Berners-Lee on COP26, and his sort of view on the end of it was sort of, there's momentum here. There's building of momentum within sort of the public, and it would be great to see sort of that push from the public, keep the momentum up and keep the pressure on.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And as promised, I'm trying to get the audience involved as much as possible. So I've had a couple of comments in, and thank you, Logan. Lovely name, Logan. I hope that now their targets, so Logan goes on to say, I hope now that targets are being set by governments, that corporations will have to accept their impact upon the environment and be held more accountable by governments, their employees and clients. I just thought that was an emphasis, though, without going too political, and I'm going to move on to the more day-to-day stuff. How much emphasis has government now put on business? Could be a whole debate in its own right. But I won't get you to answer that because I think we've covered the policy aspects to now. But thank you, Logan, for sending in your comments, and there's others that have come through. Right, I wanted to move on to this question about, despite public commitments, we have found that a concerning proportion of organisations lack baseline data for their carbon footprint, and that was further emphasised in this year's IWFM Sustainability Survey supported by Inenco. So in terms of clear objectives, a roadmap and strategy describing how the targets will be met. So bearing that all in mind, and respectively for your own organisations, the question is, how is your organisation tackling this? So I don't know who wants to come first up to bat this time round.
I'm happy to start, Peter, because I mean, I think that there's some truth in the original opening statement. I think most organisations have an ambition to be more environmentally friendly. I think a lot of them see it as perhaps being complicated, costly, time-consuming, or even perhaps they see themselves as quite a small carbon emitter, and therefore perhaps the difference that they will make is not going to be that great. So from Aviva's perspective, certainly we've had a good handle on our carbon footprint for some time. So people understand science-based targets. Our scope 1 and 2 emissions, the emissions that we're emitting as a business, I think we've had a great understanding of. If we are to get to net zero, we also need to look at our scope 3 emissions, and particularly supply chain emissions. And so we are working with our supply partners. We're 2,500, 3,000 suppliers that support Aviva. And we do find that a lot of them do not understand their own emissions, and so we're basically trying to give a bit of thought leadership. We're rather than saying to an organisation, you need to give us this number, let us know what it is. We're saying, how can we help you to derive this number? So there are tools out there in the market which we can introduce companies to, software tools. We can explain to companies how they might derive their own emissions. I think COVID has really shown us the benefit of collaboration in many aspects of what we do. I think that learning is now, in my experience, going through to delivering net zero, and that collaboration where actually there shouldn't really be a commercial tension between understanding carbon emissions, and if we can put that aside, then we can really focus on what we need to do, which is to understand what our emissions are and understand how we can reduce them.
So at the world of, thank you, Stuart, for the world of BAM FM, Reid, how are you seeing that with that, I guess, to put it simply, the helicopter view of different clients and your own organisation? How is those, how are you really tackling that, and how big is that problem?
Yeah, so from the point of view, first of all, of BAM's own corporate reporting, we have signed up to science-based targets, a bit like Stuart was describing. So we're measuring scope 1 and 2 emissions primarily, and reporting those as a group in the UK, but also through our parent to Royal BAM as a group as well. And in having those targets and the data associated with it, you can target improvement, and we are reporting about a 45% improvement in emissions since the 2015 baseline, which sounds very good, and some of that is to do with our supply chains and actions we've taken specifically for our activities. Now, a lot of those activities are construction based because largely that's what BAM Group is about. So on the second part of your question there, Peter, from the point of view of BAM FM, we have signed up to the Sustainable FM Index, who help us across a wide range of sustainability activities, but not least carbon and energy consumption, these things. We have signed up to that, and that allows us again to sort of measure and be a bit self-analytical and focus on areas for improvement. And there's various things that we're implementing ourselves, sort of electric vehicle rollout and analysis of the products that we are using, the materials and the products we're using when we're undertaking our activities. Our customers themselves have a very wide range of appreciation, maybe is a good word for decarbonisation. What we are seeing, and I think this is a question that comes up a bit later, but what we're seeing is a real acceleration in everybody's interest. And sometimes I call it kicking the tires. There's a few customers out there saying, tell us about decarbonisation, and they just need a bit more information. They're not really ready to commit to do an awful lot yet, but they're interested to know more. And I think the FM sector has an enormous opportunity to support customers in a decarbonisation plan, not just of their physical buildings, but of the services that are delivered in them, that the scope 3 items, which I'm sure Stuart and Bethany will be mindful of too. But scope 3 it's a bit like an iceberg. Scope 1 and 2 are the bit sticking above the water that we can easily measure, well, reasonably easily measure and target. Scope 3 is the stuff under the waterline, and it's just a little bit hard to tell how big it is, but holy moly, it's big.
And Reid, maybe for the purpose of me, before I kind of go to Beth, if you had to summarize scope 3, what actually is that? I know you're referencing that, but is there a way of, again, I must look for simplification as an art. I say that many times, but if you had to describe scope 3, what actually is that, just for the appreciation of some of our audience members?
So I wouldn't like to promote myself as an absolute expert in the science-based target definitions, but in a nutshell, scope 1 is the emissions that an organization directly emits, from say its own. I think of it as chimneys. If you've got a chimney or a flue and carbon's coming out of it, that's your scope 1. So maybe burning gas, but also burning fossil fuels in your vehicles. Whereas scope 2 is more energy that you're using that somebody else has generated for you, say electricity. So the power station has a flue, but you're using the electricity or a chimney, but you're using the electricity used by it. Scope 3 is the carbon emitted by your supply chain. So if you're a large organization and you outsource your FM services, then a lot of the FM services is your scope 3. But for those FM contractors, that's kind of their scope 1 and 2 a little bit. But it does get more complicated quite quickly.
No, thank you, Reid. It's just that we had a couple of comments on that definition. I appreciate you've kindly gone through that for us. So thank you. Beth, I don't know if I have to repeat the question, but hopefully you let them know. So how is your organisation, Inenco, tackling those issues in your world?
It's an interesting one for us. So we're tackling it in a few different ways. And again, we're looking at our clients quite an extent. I think most are in the measurement phase still. Most people are still trying to measure their carbon footprint. They're not actually planning. They're not getting a roadmap yet. They are just measuring. And SECA is helping with that, which is a streamlined energy carbon reporting. That is helping people to establish that baseline carbon footprint for their own emissions, mostly scopes 1 and 2. Most of them aren't touching on scopes 3 really at this point. We actually tackled this a while to get to our own carbon footprint, and we made a bold statement of offsetting against it at the time. And then we've spent the last year in actually establishing what we're going to do to actually get to a true net zero, because offsetting is one thing, it's not the right thing, it's not the goal. So we're now targeting 2035, but one of the things we're doing outside of that roadmap for our own organisation is working to try and reduce the impact of our clients. So those would be sort of related scope 3. So what we look at is how can we put pressure on the grid to decarbonise? How can we make sure that the suppliers that we work with and place our customers' portfolios with are actually green, and can we encourage that without an impact on our clients? So yeah, it's a big piece from our perspective.
So Beth, as you're on a roll there, I just want to go very pragmatic in terms of, and many people are coming in with these points. So what does a decarbonisation plan look like?
And I think that's a big question, definitely. A decarbonisation plan for me should start with where you want to end up. So you've set where you're going to get to, you set your target, and then you need to work backwards. You work backwards of what do I have to have done by a particular date in order to be able to hit this? And where's the risk? Where's the slippage? Where's what could go wrong? So for example, most of the ones I'm working on at the moment are focused around heat, because for the NHS, we're targeting an 80% reduction in their NHS footprint, which is mostly scopes 1 and 2, by 2032. Now, for an organisation with a large number of CHPs, a large number of district heating systems on sites, that's really difficult. So heat decarbonisation is mostly where this focus is at the moment. And a lot of this is enabling works. A lot of this it's sort of in BAM's world a little bit. It's understanding this building that was built maybe in 1950. How do we get it to the point where it actually is capable of running a clean heat source? So yeah, it's working backwards, putting a timeline in place, and knowing where your risks are and knowing what you absolutely have to have done by particular dates.
And I guess, Stuart, from Aviva's point of view, with Pivotal in your role, how are you building that plan within Aviva? If there's any cardinal rules or golden rules, I should say, that you could share with the audience when individuals are probably in the midst of looking at these plans respective for their organisations. I appreciate they're going to vary in size and sector.
Yeah, I think that one of the goals for me is that there'll always be something you haven't thought of. This is a massive area, and Beth actually did, I think, quite a good description. So, I created a project which is covering property, waste, IT, supply chain, and fleet and travel. So, and you've got to look at all of these things. So, we're trying to get rid of our move to electric vehicles. But there's a standard called EV 100, which is 100% electric vehicles. We're trying to get rid of any grid electricity which isn't green. So, there's RE 100. So there are things which set standards and then you can work towards. But then actually, I mean, net zero is about reducing emissions. I mean, a lot of companies will have been carbon neutral, Aviva carbon neutral since 2006. But carbon neutral was really about knowing what your emissions were and then buying offsets to make sure that they were, in theory, removed. Net zero is about reducing your emissions, and everything is aimed at reducing emissions. At the end of the day, you will have some residual emission. Current technology, no one can run I don't think an organization completely without emitting carbon. You then have to have a plan to remove that carbon, not offset it, but to remove that carbon. And I don't think that technology is yet there for some of this activity. I don't think anyone. If there's anyone on the call, please do shout that if someone's got a really good alternative to gas heating for commercial property, then I think that needs some thought. It needs some technological development. So at the moment, what we have to do is to try and reduce what we're consuming based on where the emitters that we have. So we're looking at better insulation. Putting glazing coverings on, putting blinds in windows. To have one of the things is point of use hot water heating. A lot of large commercial buildings will run their boilers throughout the summer purely and simply to provide hot water in a washroom. If you can provide a small electric heater in a washroom, you move the generation source of that heat to green electricity, so no carbon emitted, and you can turn your boilers off so that instead of running them in the summer, you're not running them in the summer. There's an investment required, of course, in those point of use hot water heaters. So those are small things. I think we will be doing lots of those tactical things while we're working with larger organisations to say what is the next step for gas heating in general.
Oh, thank you, Stuart. And as Stuart's kindly done the call out to the audience, please get engaged in the Q&A if you hear anything. We have got questions about tools and technology later, but if there's any viewpoints, please share them. Reid, I'm just going to move on quickly in terms of if you want to add to that question, please do.
I suppose, it's not a decarbonisation plan is going to be highly specific to an organisation and the sites it occupies. But I think in general, just relating to what Stuart was saying there, I think absolutely right that the starting point here is about reducing your energy consumption first with insulation, with efficient BMS and maybe LED lighting type of projects to rapidly reduce and efficiently, cost effectively reduce your energy consumption. And then you can start thinking about energy demand and how you're going to decarbonize that. And there are 100% green energy tariffs in the marketplace, which sometimes are a bit questionable as to really whether that is zero carbon energy, but it's intended to come from renewable energy sources. And only today, I think the Co-op announced a really big corporate PPA where they're procuring green energy from wind and PV that's generated elsewhere. But it's like 100% green energy on steroids. They've gone straight to the generators and bought that generation. So there's big commercial arrangements that can be considered as well as big physical arrangements.
No, thank you, Reid. And I guess we've mentioned software and tools a little bit already in today's episode, but what are the key tools needed to support a commitment to reducing carbon emissions? Is there a silver bullet out there, or is it not as simple as that? So it'd be just interesting to know what tools, technology you guys respectively are using to help you on that journey.
Can I jump in there? Just to
go on,
start,
Reid,
yeah. So I think we've already talked about data a little bit, and collecting data is really important. A couple of years ago, when people weren't really talking about decarbonisation so much, just talking about energy efficiency because they want, on an economic basis, and subsequently that's become more of a carbon interest as well. But often when we said to customers, what energy data have you got? We would just receive monthly bills. And the quality of that data is extraordinarily poor, because actually what we need is half-hour type data, because what's really interesting about energy now is it doesn't really matter sometimes how much you use, but when you use it. And that's not really fair. It does matter how much you use, but what's often as important is when you use it, and using high quality AMR, so it's like automatic meter recording. You can receive half-hour data from gas, water, electricity meters, from sub-meters and main meters, and you can very easily analyze that there's lots of tools out there that will help you do this, and you can see when you're wasting energy. Things, I call it night at the museum. We had a number of buildings when we first plugged this on. You discover the building seemed to come alive at midnight and 1 o'clock in the morning. You go, what is going on here? But the insight you got was remarkable. And compared with monthly bills or even weekly meter reading, where you don't see that granularity, you stood no chance of making any informed management decisions about where you could make energy efficiency, energy improvement. So that technology is out there, and compared with sites where in the past I was receiving and analysing 36 bits of data, I'm now getting 5.25 million bits of data on energy. Actually, yeah, I don't really know what to do with that. I've got somebody else that deals with that. Thank goodness. But the information's fabulous, and it allows you to make much better decisions and make some really effective energy improvement really quickly and cheaply as well. There's probably others, but I'll just, in the interest of time, I'll stop there.
And Beth, anything to comment on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because that's sort of where we come in. So where you end up with that overload of data, that's where organizations like ourselves step in. First thing first, though, from an absolute basics, if anyone on the call has half-hourly electricity meters in a MOP DCDA standard contract, go away and get them contracted on day plus one data. Because that gives you a great starting point. It's cheap, it's quick, it's easy, and you'll get that half-hourly data off those meters. You should also be seeing SMEC2 rollouts, if not AMR, on your non-half-hourly electricity meters as well. So from a billing meter perspective, there is no reason anymore not to have this data. And then, yeah, go away and get it into a system. So building management systems is sort of I love building management systems. They're sort of my thing. I think they absolutely can play a huge role here in terms of this. And there is AI involvement now where you can get AI data managers involved. But as an interim step, people like ourselves, we have people who sit there and analyze data. We have systems that can flag problems, flag when you've got exceptions, like a building coming on in the middle of the night. And one more throwback to my old world of BMS would be where you've got a panel, get someone to hook everything up to a relay to tell you if something is out of auto position. It's cheap, it's quick, it's easy. It's a single digital relay back into your system that can put a warning up to tell you if someone has put something out of auto, because that will cost you carbon, it will cost you money. And it's usually just someone's walked away from the panel and forgotten to flip a switch.
So I'm not sure I'm keen on this phrase, I'm going to use it, but there are some quick wins that people could do in terms. So if I jump to Stuart about measuring and reporting, it sounds like on the examples Beth and Reid have given that measuring and reporting is probably at the highest it's ever been. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I was group property director, and I was always a little bit, Aviva's group property director, I was always a little bit reluctant to invest too much in sensors historically. Desk sensors and who's sitting where, etc. Now I think you really do need to know a lot more about what's going on in your building. I mean, from a COVID perspective, it's really good to know what CO2 levels are, because that can give you an idea of how good your ventilation is. I think having heat sensing, And suddenly, if you can link as we have that to your BMS, you can start to really reduce energy where you felt you couldn't do any more. But having variable speed drives, having some sort of machine learning in your BMS, so that it starts to understand, what's the outside temperature, what's the floor load in terms of people. Do I really need to start that at 6 in the morning? Can I start it at 7? So I think that's so there's a lot of measurement out there. What I will say is though that's enabled us to play a little bit more with environment and working with the occupants, because of course it's the occupants who are experiencing an environment. And we in Aviva in October we turned down the set point temperatures of our buildings by about 1.5 degrees. So we're running at about 19.5 or something like that. And yes, we've had the odd bit of pushback, and interesting when you get a picture of someone in one of our buildings in November saying they're too cold and they're wearing a t-shirt. But the fact is that working with our people, our colleagues in the workplace, to say, look, we're trying some stuff, much perhaps like you might do at home. Rather than changing the temperature of your thermostat, you might change your clothing. Let's see if we can work together. And I know that across the UK estate only, and we're introducing this temperature reduction into Ireland and Canada as well, we've saved 100 tonnes of carbon equivalent in terms of gas usage in October. We started on the 1st of October versus October 20. October 20 was a lockdown month, so we would have expected that to be low. And we've done some normalisation for ambient temperature, and we are showing at least 100-tonne reduction. So that's a no-cost change, working with occupants, but actually knowing what's happening on the floor, having all that sensor activity, being able to adjust temperatures, has been a real driver and enabler of that activity. But you can do things which don't have to cost an arm and a leg. And there's part of collaboration, FM providers working with the occupants of the building and saying, can we make some changes?
Well, thanks, Stuart. And I've weaved a couple of points in there to the questions because of time, but how will carbon reduction in your client organisations be financed? So I think there's some examples there are some quick wins and low cost, but generally across the piece, how is this going to be financed? And Reid, I'd love to get your viewpoint, maybe from your different clients. How are they tackling this?
Yeah,
and it's the dreaded money debate, I'm afraid.
It is, and until recently, energy projects were financed from a kind of the idea of a payback, the principle of a payback, and sometimes there was also some capital allocation from maybe a programmed life cycle replacement of a component, whether that was a part of a BMS or a heating plant. And we've seen over the last 5 years or so a lot of lighting replacement, replacing fluorescent tubes with LED, where there was an economic argument for it, but also the lighting control systems were sometimes becoming obsolete. So maintaining the system was becoming cost prohibitive, which accelerated the rollout of an alternative. And for the first time, just as a point of interest, for the very first time, we're looking at a project where we're replacing an early LED project with a new LED project. So that's the first time that's happened that I'm aware of, which is interesting. And that's just sheer run hours. It was a 24-hour kind of lit car park. So it got to its 50,000 hours and the diodes have started popping. I'm trying to remember what the question was now. Oh, you financed, yeah. So I think one of the things here that we're seeing, if we're seeing any pattern at all, is that decarbonisation is happening. It doesn't happen in one big project, or it doesn't tend to happen in one single big project. It tends to be lots of individual projects that are kind of stepping stones towards a 2030 or a 2040 goal. And for that reason, they can be kind of budgeted for and prepared for. As I said earlier, maybe depending on the nature of the organization, the nature of the sites, it might be that there is already anticipated capital projects for component replacements or asset replacements along the way. And what we're doing is maybe replacing what was going to be a CHP engine or some gas boilers with a an electrical alternative or an alternative. So it may be that many organizations, you don't have to splurge an enormous amount of money in 2022 or 2023, because actually the decarbonisation journey is going to be made up of a number of efforts over 8 years or more, maybe. So organizations might be able to finance it out from a number of places, savings and distributed kind of capital projects.
No, thank you, Reid. And yeah, I will encourage the audience to keep sending your questions in. We're getting to that point in the episode where we go to your questions. But Beth, I want to come to you, obviously, with the clue of the NHS. An intriguing question, I think. Are you sensing a difference in approach to delivering net zero between the public and private sectors?
I think we've got differences and we've got overlap. Is the way I would put it. So certainly the current state's net zero carbon delivery plan from the NHS is very focused on these quick win projects, make every kilowatt hour count. They're very focused on the cost and carbon positive projects at the moment. They've also had access to funding from things like public sector decarbonisation scheme, which has allowed some quite ambitious projects moving to air source heat pumps to go ahead, which is great. And that's a good test case. But very much like the private sector, those large, complex conversations to try and get a building to actually fully refurbish down to net zero, that's a long way off still. We're still looking at piecemeal projects, I think. A quick touch on funding of a really interesting one, which I don't know, obviously heading back, but I was at University Healthcare Estates Innovation the other week. And one of the things that we saw was actually people with funds coming to that to say, come to us and ask for loans, because we want to invest in things that are net zero. We want to be decarbonising our investments. So that's a really interesting one, just on that as an aside.
No, thank you. And Stuart, to bring you in, I guess from that point of view, is it safe to say that we're seeing an increased commitment to carbon reduction generally across the industry? Obviously, with your experience at Aviva, and I know you're representing Aviva today, are you sensing that?
I am, but I think it needs to be pushed by people. There needs to be a demand, and I think it's probably an area like no other where you make a demand, you tend to get some sort of positive response because it's something that interests everybody. So just as a couple of examples, the funding is interesting in that if you're a major occupant of a building or the owner of a building, then obviously making the investment yourself, finding the money, having a payback over time, all of that return comes back to you, provided you can afford the upfront capital investment. A lot of companies, and Aviva in some cases, will be a minor occupant of a larger building, and therefore you've got to try and bring the landlord to the table. And I think that's where we have found that landlords are amenable to those discussions. That they're amenable to have ideas about what they might do in their buildings. And one of our buildings, we haven't got a particularly long tenure. We've agreed that there will be solar panels put on that building, which Aviva will fund. But actually, we've come to an agreement where, at the end of the lease, there's either a guaranteed value of those assets, or the landlord themselves actually will take them on as a building asset rather than as they will be in the future for now a tenant asset. So I think it's really. I think that the level of interest that you're going to get from others is only limited by what you're prepared to ask for, because people really are prepared to work together, and there is a lot of good ideas out there.
No, thank you, Stuart. So as promised, we're going to go and read. You're about to
sorry.
come in.
Yeah, I was just a gross oversight by me as well. Is there are ESCO and PPA arrangements out there, and Stuart and Bethany actually touched on this idea that there is a third source of money out there, not just maintenance or savings and investment from life cycle alternative, but actually corporate kind of PPAs are possible effectively, where customers can buy renewable energy as a service, if you like, and another party will invest in air source heat pumps or solar PV or this kind of thing. As a service, in fact, that's something BAM are also able to provide. So yeah, just I should have mentioned that before.
A really quick one around PPAs. I've avoided jumping in too much on them, but just to be really careful about additionality, because the huge advantage of a PPA is that you can create real additionality and new things being built. But one of the things that we see on quite a lot of these larger schemes is that it's actually investing in existing assets, which to us is a wasted opportunity. If you're going to do a PPA, you're going to do it and you're going to actually make sure you're adding to the grid greening.
No, thank you both for adding to that. And it feels like the whole finance question could be an episode in its own right in terms of the level of what you're going into there. So as promised, I'd like to go to questions. We've had a couple of comments going back to earlier point where I encourage people about the COP debate. Thank you, Michael. He said, can someone expand on the biodiversity COP for how wide this would cover, please, if possible? I think that possibly might be aimed at you, Beth, where you brought up the importance of biodiversity. I don't know if you've got anything to add to Michael's point there.
I do. I can't remember exactly where it is. I do apologise for that, but it's in around about March or April next year. So these happen regularly as well. I think it's COP 12 or 15 or something around that on biodiversity. They are similar to the COPs that we talk about all the time. And what we're starting to see is obviously the understanding that links in with the COPs that we talk about all the time. So the thing that I'm hoping is going to happen is we've got this biodiversity one. There was an open letter to the NHS around biodiversity and biodiversity targeting following COP26. And I'm expecting that is an indication that we're going to see more talk at COP27 around the actual biodiversity side of this. And my aspiration in the end is that these two really should be one, because you should be talking about the whole piece.
Thank you, Beth. Thanks.
You can find some more information if you need it.
No, great for that. So we got questions coming through panel, so that's always good. Thank you for your comment from a gentleman that's I'm not from the UK, but going back to COP again, is it more effective to set COP26 goals legally for compulsory compliance? I don't know if that's a simple yes or no. I don't know how far they are legally compliant. So did anyone want to come in there on that point?
Well, there is corporate reporting required for companies over a certain size. I'd think that an improvement could be if the government reduced the floor of that, so that more companies were required to identify and report on carbon and have an improvement plan. And I'd also be of a mind that professional bodies should maybe be seeking that their members, to be a member of a professional body as an organization rather than as an individual, but they should require their members to maybe have carbon reporting and plans in place too. But some of those things are maybe a bit far off still.
No, thank you for that. And as I say, this viewer listeners indicate they're not from the UK, but thank you, Reid, for just articulating some of the measures that are in place. Right, we've got an anonymous person that's put this question forward, but thank you, whoever you are. The question is, can we refurbish our way to net zero, or do we need to change our behaviour and use of buildings? They have got a second question. How is this reflected in net zero plans you are seeing implemented? So I think there's certainly a question about behaviour, usage of buildings, and how is this being implemented in net zero plans? So who wants to take those questions, because they're two questions in their own right?
Yeah. I'm prepared just to say a little bit about can we refurbish. I think the answer is that depends. I mean, we had a building, a freehold building that we built in 2004. It was a single-story building, but it had quite a large car park. And we installed basically a carport-based solar panel array in the carport. We put a lot of solar on the roof. We implemented sensors and building management adjustments. And then we had an EPC done for the building, and the EPC came out as A. So effectively, we had taken a building which I think had previously been an EPC E building to A, and it's effectively sitting in a net zero position. So that's something that we with the right ownership, the right location geographically, I think you can do that. The other thing about is existing assets have embedded carbon, and you know, it would be, you know, an environmental crime to destroy a lot of buildings in order to rebuild new ones because of the carbon that's invested in them. So we need to understand that the built environment is already absorbed and creating a lot of carbon, and we need to protect that as we move to refurbish. I think in the longer term, what we need to do is to make sure that new building stock coming online does align to net zero requirements. And I'm not sure that currently is the case. I'm not sure we currently have moved our building control, especially commercial buildings, to a position where, you know, they're demanding net zero. They might be demanding various what are considered to be historic high levels of environmental compliance, but I'm not sure that net zero has yet got into building design.
Thank you, Stuart, for that. Beth, I'm going to bring you in on this question that's come through about how are you engaging with your supply chain to ensure consistency and joint commitment to carbon reduction? So within your world, as you mentioned with the NHS, how are you ensuring that standardized and there's a consistency approach? So again, probably linking to the previous question about behavior and culture here, which is probably adamant of how we're going to get to the goals essentially. So is there any tips or any advice out there around how you ensure that everyone's committed? I guess it links to behavior I've mentioned.
I think there's some real advantages here of being in the NHS world, because centrally the NHS has a huge power when it comes to procurement, and they have now started to put out a roadmap of what they will expect from their supply chain, and that does include the fact that they will stop buying from suppliers who are not aligned to net zero goals and achieving on their plans to reach net zero goals by certain dates. So, and they will rank their suppliers in terms of how good they are. They have the power to do that because they are a huge purchaser. It's much more difficult for an independent private organisation to expect that of their supply chain, although they should be working with them collaboratively to do it. Behaviour change is huge for the NHS, and the savings available just from educating the workforce are huge. And I think from my perspective, things like occupancy censoring, understanding use of buildings, and training your workforce are absolutely good starting points to start to understand where you have waste, where you have problems.
Yeah, and Reid, I'd like to bring you in on that, obviously from your client and obviously your helicopter view across different clients. Anything to add to what Beth said there, really, from your viewpoint?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think picking up just first from Stuart, we had some statistics that were getting thrown around recently that 80% of the buildings that will exist in 2050 already exist. So we're not going to build our way out of this problem. And as Stuart said, that would be terrible anyway, because there's so much embodied carbon in the, the existing buildings we already have. So we have to be able to refurbish our way out of this. And that's a combination of physical, maybe, and behavioural change. And some of those behavioural changes might be about more flexible working and things like that. It'd be quite a complex linkage of lots of factors that help us achieve it. I think the behaviour is really important, and I think we've been struggling for a few years, maybe slightly misfiring for a few years with trying to control buildings and control people and measure things. And we haven't quite been able to sort of square the circle on that with data that actually either changes behavior or informs behavior quickly enough to do something about it, or even then integrates into a building so that the building can maybe react or do something about it. However, I think we are at quite a pivotal moment with IoT devices and CO2 monitors and all sorts of things where they are configured with BMS languages like Niagara, for example, where actually for the first time we can quite easily implement large numbers of reasonably cheap sensors and either get the data into our possession to make decisions live, or even integrate that into a BMS quite straightforwardly and economically for the building maybe to react. So we're coming into this pivotal point now where I think some of these tools will become available and affordable, and they'll actually work. which is a bonus.
Which is key. They actually work.
Yeah.
So I'm aware of time. I'm going to have the last question really that has combined a couple that's come in from the audience, and this is going to go to all the panelists. I'm going to start off with yourself, dear self, Stuart, about what can we learn from your organisations and individually in terms of taking a lead on sustainability? And probably the killer question, well, they're all killer to a degree, is the role of facilities management in that journey. So I know it's a biggie to end on, but I think it's important. We've gone through it, but who's accountable and responsibility is this? And also the role of the facilities manager.
So the important thing for me is that this can't be an add-on to someone else's job. And I think, Aviva, by appointing me as net zero delivery director, that is my job. I was group property director, so I understand facilities and what goes on there, but there is a new group property director. So I think someone has to be accountable for this. And my program at the moment is working hard to make sure that in each of the areas, IT, waste, facilities, procurement, etc., there is someone who is accountable for this, and it's their only job. It's too big just to do off the side of your desk. I think facilities has a huge role, and we've touched on it a little bit. And the facilities, I think it is of course about M&E and cleaning and catering and all the rest of it. It's actually more about the people who are enjoying those services. I think that link between what the people are enjoying and the impact of the services on the environment, if we can start to work on that link to make sure that the services are reducing their impact on the environment, then it will work. So someone needs to be accountable, not side of the desk, and definitely facilities collaborating with our building occupants have a key part to play.
Thank you, Stuart. And if I come to you next, Beth, from your viewpoint, anything to add to what Stuart said there?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think you must have a person who is accountable. And that's something that you need to start to have in every organisation, but particularly where I deal with organisations, often it's one person's job to handle a lot of different things and juggle things. And I think we need a lot more experts in this space. We need a lot more people who that is all they're doing, but also where they have groups where they can collaborate like this and talk about best practice and talk about what's working, because this is a collaborative thing. You might want to compete against your natural competitors, but actually you all need to come on this journey, and we should be sharing knowledge.
And this is what we're trying to do with our webinars today and other activity of guidance and research. And final word, Reid, respect to that, obviously from BAM FM, a construction FM company. Obviously, what's your view on that? One, the FM's role and how actually responsible facilities management and their role to play in this massive agenda.
So I think there's a balance to strike between the new buildings that are being built and whether or not there's a fixed or a firm requirement on them to be net zero or not. What we are seeing is most customers trying to procure a net zero new building to start with, and that might become a little bit watered down on an economic cost basis, but the intent of most customers is very good, and from an FM point of view in BAM, we're also supporting some of the kind of choices that are being made around the configuration of heat pumps or renewable energy and balancing that out with reduced consumption or demand. So we get a little bit involved in that. My real interest from where I sit in BAM, in BAM FM, BAM Energy, is this existing estate, because we've got a very large number of customers who aren't in new buildings. They're in much older buildings, many of which don't perform very well and need a lot of planning to get them to where the occupants want them to be. And we've spoken about this briefly already, and I think that's a really interesting area, and I think FM can be at the very heart of that. But between the contractor, whether that's a BAM company and the customer, I think Stuart's right and Bethany's right. There has to be somebody in that customer organization who really has responsibility and is going to drive this and make it happen, because it's not just going to be something that you can do part-time in most organizations. I think the other thing that FM do, and I kind of blow my own trumpet again just for a moment, I think the scope 3 is an area that will quite soon come under a lot more scrutiny by customers. At scope 1, for the leaders in this sector, in this activity, scope 1 and 2 are becoming quite accustomed to that and very good at that. And I think the attention will be onto the supply chain and what they're doing, and that comes into this kind of scope 3 definition. And BAM has sponsored a bit of work that is being authored by the SFMI, and IWFM are also a participant from a reviewing point of view. That's a first paper has been published talking about kind of guidance for the FM sector and how we might report more consistently and better on our scope 3 emissions, and there'll be more publications next year about that in 2022. And I do think that's an area where FM again can make really big inroads. That's the bit of the iceberg I was talking about that's below the waterline. It's kind of hard to see, hard to measure, but I imagine there's also big improvements to be found there.
No, thank you. And yeah, you mentioned some of the activity that us as an institute is supporting to continue with this. And I think at this point, I want to say thank you to the viewers, listeners. This will have to draw a close to question time. Thank you for your questions. For those that we couldn't go through today, I've hopefully gone through most of them because I've tried to interlink them with the questions and debate today. We will send on to a panelist. But at this point, I want to say a massive thank you to Beth, Stuart and Reid for their contribution today. I have got a couple of closing slides. I think hopefully today our audience have found out the net zero promises. We started off with the political, the policy landscape, but actually highlighting today, respectively with the audience and the panelists today, what people are actually currently doing to actually get progress. And we've heard snippets today. I appreciate we only got an hour around the areas of what's working in their organisations, the measuring, reporting, the issue around finance, which I have to argue probably is a whole debate in its own right, and the different mechanisms of that world and the challenges and opportunities, of course. But I just want to say a massive thank you to the panelists once again for joining us. And as I promised, I've got a couple of closing slides. So for CPD, the number in today's event you can see on your screens there. So please register that on your CPD code for your own professional development. That's important. As mentioned, I mentioned the sustainability survey that was supported by Beth, who's joined us from Inenco. That report is available on our website that tackles some of the questions we raised today about measuring and reporting, and also moving from intent to action, which we've highlighted today, some of the action that's happening today. Research reports, good practice guides, which we've got around energy management, which Reid supported us on. So thank you again, Reid, for that. And guidance notes and lots more. We also have a dedicated sustainability hub as well on our website. Now, we've put this in terms of podcasts. It's a mechanism we're using alongside webinars to show our content. And I know many of you are frequent podcast users, I'm sure. But we've got a podcast offering currently with a partner, Sodexo, that's looking at the massive issue of well-being, and an issue that will continue for a long time going into 2022 and longer. So please look out for that. There's 4 episodes focusing on well-being with well-being experts giving their view around the topic. So please look out for that. And once again, I just want to say thank you to Beth, Stuart and Reid for joining us today for this hour. I said we could go on for another hour, but I'm aware of time, we can't. Viewers, listeners, I want to say a massive thank you for joining us today. Last request would be if you could complete a short survey after this episode. It's not only rating today's episode, but what future episodes you would like to see. Yes, this was 64 in our series. We've actioned, we've listened to your views, and that's what's really driven our content on our webinar series for the last 2 years, pretty much, when we kicked this off back in March. So just want to thank you for that and your continued support. And at this point, I want to say, sadly, this is our last episode of 2021, which I've been pleased to be part of many of the episodes. But at this point, I would just want to say a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to everyone that's joined us. We do get regular listener viewers. Some people have joined us here today for the first time. So just want to say a massive thank you for joining us today. And as I say, have a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. And our series will kick off in the new year once again. So thank you, take care all, and thanks once again.